You might have noticed already, there's a lot of different species that exist out there. So let's talk about how they form through the process of speciation. Now we're going to talk about speciation, the process that's the reason why we have so many different species out there. Here you can see there's a phylogenetic tree with lots of different lovely birds. Speciation, the word, this just means the process of forming new species, and there's a couple different ways it can happen. We can talk about anagenesis versus cladogenesis. This is very similar to the difference between phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium, but we're just talking at a very specific process on the formation of new species. Anagenesis is where we see the gradual transition from one species to the next. So this is within a one population, and that population just turns into this different form. So you can see in this bird species here, much of the morphology is broadly similar. The feathers are about the same length, and we mostly see a difference in the coloration of this bird. Cladogenesis, though, is a little bit different. Cladogenesis is where there's one population that stays pretty much the same over time, but there's a small part of them that make a drastic change and form a new population with a different form. And generally, we see bigger differences. So you can see there's a difference in coloration, but also in their feathers. They now have much longer tail feathers. But at the end of this, we also see that original form still exists. So this is what you have to prove for cladogenesis. You have to prove that the new form coexists with the parent population at the same time. There are also a couple different models for how we think speciation can happen. The most common is allopatric, or where speciation happens with a geographical barrier in between. Under this model, we start with one big population, but there's something that divides them roughly in half. Here, think of a big geographical obstacle, a mountain range, a river, an ocean. And during that period of isolation where these populations are not in contact with each other, they just evolve differently. Maybe their environments are a little bit different, so natural selection pushes them in different directions. Or through genetic drift, they could just randomly accumulate differences. And then afterwards, they might come into contact again, but they are distinctly different and they will not interbreed with each other. The second model is parapatric. This is a little bit different. So now we have one big population, but they expand into a new niche or a new environment that's a little bit different. And because these two places are a little bit different, even though they are next to each other, parapatric just means they are next to or abutting each other. That's where they evolve separately, become different enough so that even though they may overlap at the end, they still do not interbreed with each other. The last version is a little bit more controversial. This is sympatric speciation. So here, again, we start the original population in one place, but for some reason, there's a genetic polymorphism within the same environment, and within that population, we actually see the evolution of reproductive isolation, and later we have two distinct populations that do not interbreed with each other. Sympatric speciation is controversial, and not everyone agrees with it. But some people still like to bring it up for some few interesting cases. Let's go back to our allopatric speciation, though. This one is widely understood and we know happens a lot. When we're looking at modern chimpanzees versus bonobos, bonobos have that darker faces, and you see they're a little bit south of that Congo River there, and chimpanzees are north. So we think that there was this ancestral reproductive barrier of the Congo River that separated bonobos from chimpanzees and allowed them to evolve separately into new species. We also see the differences between the northern spotted owl and the Mexican owl. So these owls are broadly similar, but you can see there's a lot of mountains in between. Well, I guess you can't see them on this map, but the Rocky Mountains are in between those populations of owls, causing them to be separate. So now we consider them different species. So these are very clear examples of allopatric speciation, but there are also some less clear examples, and that's some of the reasons why we have these other models for speciation. One of them are ring species. So here in these ring species, specifically in California, these are Ensatina lizards. And you can see there's different populations of lizards that are pretty similar, and each population can interbreed with the next one over, all through this little loop here. But right where the loop comes back together, those populations cannot interbreed with each other. So this is a little bit more confusing, and we don't entirely know what's going on. This is a similar story for these birds here in Siberia and Mongolia. So we have this ring here where each population can interbreed with the populations on either side, but when they come back together, they are reproductively isolated and they do not interbreed with each other. So ring species are the primary example for why parapatric speciation exists and is a valid model, but not everybody agrees. Lastly, let's talk about sympatric speciation. So sympatric speciation is when it happens within the same geographical area. The best example we have are when flies jumped to apple trees in New York. So in the state of New York, where I live, hawthorn trees are the native plants. But with European settlers, they brought apple trees from Europe. And apple trees do very well here. And now that's one of the reasons why we're known as the Big Apple. So our native flies, some of them actually made the switch and now live and eat on apple trees. Well, of course, some of them stayed on hawthorn trees. So now these species of flies do seem to be very different, and we do consider them different species with marked behavioral differences. So this is one possible example of sympatric speciation. Some people like to argue that this isn't sympatric speciation and it's really microallopatric speciation because these are distinctly different plants. And they both eat and mate on the trees, so these different species of flies wouldn't actually come into contact when they're reproducing because they instinctively have different foods. So splitting hairs a little bit, but that's what evolutionary biology is all about. When we're talking about sympatric speciation, something that might be going on is called disruptive selection, where the middle form is being selected against, but the extreme on either end is actually being selected for, and that could cause the evolution of two distinct populations. You could also think of it as there could be behavioral differences or differences in how species use the environment that could cause these differences to arise. So in this example here, allopatric speciation is caused by a river, but sympatric speciation could be that some of these butterflies choose to be active at night versus during the day, and that is what could cause the formation of two different species in the same geographical area. Regardless of what model of speciation you're talking about, what we're looking to form is a reproductive isolating mechanism. And this just means anything that prevents interbreeding. It can be behavioral, it can be ecological, or it can be anatomical. And there's a lot of different ones. So the most common one is a geographic barrier, and that's what we're talking about in allopatric speciation. But it could also simply be an activity pattern difference. So if you use your environment at night, you're never going to run into organisms that only use it during the day. Could also simply be a mechanical issue. You simply cannot fit together to mate. Or you could not recognize each other as mates, even though you might be physically compatible. It could also happen after mating, so you might have hybrid children, but they are sterile, such as we see in mules. Or the offspring could be non-viable. So maybe it's born, but it's very sick and it dies at a very young age, or maybe the pregnancy is aborted mid-pregnancy. So these are some of the examples of a reproductive isolating mechanism that could prevent interbreeding between two different species. So can you explain? What is speciation and what are some of the models for how it can happen?